to the We Are LAC podcast. This is our very first episode, and it is very experimental. I am Heather. I am a facilitator in decolonization, anti-oppression work, and organizational change. And this is Lavinia.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Lavinia. I'm an ex-sustainability manager in the dirty fashion industry, but nowadays I work primarily with rights holders, building connections and networks of grassroots organizations and unions. And this is Chris.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Chris. I practice authentic community engagement, environmental analysis, and sustainability through the lens of social justice.
Welcome. So we are your three podcast hosts, but today one of us will be the guest.
Yes, and it is Chris. Chris, we are going to be discussing an article you wrote in June of this year, 2024. Would you like to summarize it for us?
Sure. Well, I wrote an article about how difficult it will be to decarbonize the global aviation industry. To do this, I use publicly available information, but I also use my insider's knowledge to find some publicly available sources that I'm not sure many writers have seen. I was trained as an aeronautical engineer, and for my graduate studies, I researched how aircraft operations affect air pollution and human health. This opened the door to a job in the United States federal government as a part of the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA for short. When I joined the FAA, I began managing research projects that looked at emissions from aircraft engines. I also helped to develop engine emissions policies and regulations. Well, it turns out that there's a little-known body of the United Nations known as the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO for short, where nearly all environmental regulations originate for aviation. Because aviation is such a global industry, aircraft operators like the world's biggest airlines don't want to find themselves subject to a quote-unquote patchwork of different regulations in different countries. So operators and governments, as well as aircraft manufacturers, get together at ICAO to develop, in their words, harmonized regulations that apply equally across the whole world. ICAO launched its own global carbon market for international aviation several years ago after having talked about the idea of this since the late 1990s. This is called the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA. I believe that CORSIA is the first global carbon offsetting scheme for any sector, and around the year 2027, it essentially becomes mandatory for most airlines in the world to join. In the year 2021, over 300 airlines carrying a majority of the world's traffic made a commitment to go net zero carbon by the year 2050. But aircraft operations are continuing to grow. COVID definitely impacted air traffic, but there's been a major recovery of operations worldwide. ICAO's own analysis shows that operations could potentially double by the year 2050. So that's a lot of carbon dioxide to abate in order to reach net zero. The industry insists that it wants to aggressively develop and deploy lower emissions aircraft technologies, plus all types of sustainable aviation fuels, or SAF, to abate most of their emissions. Then the emissions left over, the so-called residual emissions, would be offset using CORSIA. Even an aggressive deployment scenario, however, shows that the industry would have to offset roughly the entire year 2022 emissions of Ethiopia or Qatar on an annual basis to be net zero in the year 2050. And the dollar cost of developing and deploying these technologies in SAF would be enormous, in the multiple trillions with a T. These numbers come from ICAO's own analysis. In the least aggressive deployment scenario, the industry would have to offset the entire year 2022 emissions of Japan or Iran, again on an annual basis to be net zero in 2050. Even this least ambitious scenario would cost over $1 trillion for the development and deployment of expected technologies and fuels. And the cost of carbon offsetting in CORSIA would be on top of all of that. So these are massive dollars we're talking about, as well as massive hope that, number one, this kind of money would be invested in the industry. Number two, the advanced technologies and SAF will be available at a sufficient scale. And number three, there are enough carbon offsetting projects around the world available to offset any remaining carbon dioxide emissions every single year to be net zero. That's why I wrote my article. I really wanted to help people understand just how big the aviation decarbonization challenge really is.
Thank you, Chris. And we'll put a link to the article in the episode notes in case anyone would like to read it. And you can also pause the podcast and read it before listening to the rest if you like. But basically, you're talking about real sustainability Inc. stuff here, like real, like when people think about sustainability in a mainstream world, they think about things like the emissions from a particular industry. They think about
Carbon
how
offsetting.
offsetting. Yeah, exactly. And so let's start with this obsession with key performance indicators, KPIs, and what is wrong with those. Because when we look at carbon emissions, we usually hear about some kind of calculation. We're trying to get to a particular number, and maybe it's net zero. And whenever policies are dominated by trying to reach a certain number, we bump into all kinds of problems like unintended consequences, perverse incentives. So, for example, if a country is like England, not like the US, but like England, we're trying to reduce waiting times to get doctor appointments. There's an incentive to remove certain categories that they're counting so that it looks like the waiting times are shorter than they actually are. So, what kind of perverse incentives do you see playing out in the aviation industry around carbon emissions?
Yeah, I think it's really great that, first of all, you talked about this being really the embodiment of Sustainability Inc. in a certain way. And that, second of all, you talked about reaching a number. I think when I hear that phrase, Sustainability Inc., I really think of a worldview, not just necessarily a set of businesses or a sector, but a worldview that in our conversation represents, you know what, this climate change thing is really, really bad, but we have so many conveniences in the modern world. What can we do to mitigate and solve the climate change problem while maintaining our quote unquote way of life? And aviation is very much a part of that. And we'll get into the nuances of the aviation sector and the different parts of it a little later in this conversation. But when many people think of aviation, they think of travel, going to different countries and seeing the world, perhaps going back home to see their family and friends. And that's a big part of aviation, but it's not the only part. So we'll discuss a little bit the nuances of the sector later in our conversation. This idea of a number, I think it's interesting because I was trained as an aeronautical engineer, and then for my graduate studies, as I mentioned earlier, I looked at how aviation affects human health and air emissions. So this really involved a set of technical activities. So looking at how many operations happened in a certain year, looking at the types of aircraft and their emissions profile. So there's a series of calculations that convert fuel consumption to emissions of different air pollutants and carbon dioxide, depending on the aircraft type. And then you take those numbers, you put them into a computer model, and the computer actually flies the airplane in the computer model and calculates all the emissions and sums them all up. So when I talk about policy and being a policy analyst by training, to a certain degree, it was very much a scientific and numerical type of, shall we say, policy development process. And in fact, if you were to open the documents, the regulations, and so on that actually describe the regulatory standards aircraft have to meet for noise and for carbon dioxide and different air pollutants, what you'll essentially see is a bunch of equations that draw different curves that different aircraft have to meet. And it depends on the year of release, it depends on the type of aircraft, the number of engines, etc. So that was my training, a numerical, mathematical, analytical type of policy analysis. And it wasn't until I started getting into ICAO meetings back when I was in government where I was able to see the, I think what I would say now, the political aspects of policy development. So as an example, this idea of baselining, if a policy selects a certain high emissions year as a baseline, let's say the year 2019, when aircraft operations were at an all-time high, then if you have a policy regime where airlines get credit for reducing emissions, for instance, there's an incentive to pick a high emissions year because technology is improving all the time. So the higher you make that baseline, the more credit you can get for making a reduction. And it's interesting because Corsia, I believe, was supposed to use the year 2020 as a baseline, and then COVID happened. And the operations were 2/3, maybe half of what they were in 2019. And that really bothered certain entities in the industry because they knew that if they used 2020 as a baseline, there would be a natural recovery and emissions would go up from that. So I believe that there was an ICAO process to discuss rebaselining Corsia. I wasn't a part of that because it was after I left government. But that's just a small example that I had to see with my own eyes to realize that policy development is not just a numerical engineering exercise, that there are political undercurrents in policymaking. And I want to talk about this word political for just a little bit, because I've heard some people use the word politics to mean a couple different things. The word politics as talking about the United States Democratic Party versus the United States Republican Party, as an example. So very much electoral politics. That's what the word politics means. I've heard some people use the word politics to talk about, as one person put it, backroom dealing or undercurrents, nefarious undercurrents in business, and that if people would just stop the backroom dealing and the side conversations and get politics out of business, the world would be so much better. Well, when I use the word politics in this circumstance, I'm talking about what readers, well, what I'm trying to say. When I use the word politics in this circumstance, I'm talking about writers. And my reading has helped to inform me of really in the last couple of years, which is that this word politics, especially in the context of this podcast, is about the power relations between people and between institutions. And it's those power relations that are much bigger than just political parties, much bigger than just how people conduct themselves in business and private versus in public. It's really something, from that definition, is something that undergirds all human interactions and is always present. In fact, I've certainly said for many years now that technology is inherently political. We might even say that nearly all things are political. And certainly we can get into the nuances of that over time in this conversation and in the podcast at large. So I just want to swing back to what you're talking about, Heather, this idea of KPIs and perverse incentives. Well, since we're on the topic of carbon markets, a huge focus on carbon dioxide, in my belief, as the primary area of sustainability, you might say Sustainability Inc., as embodied in the aviation sector, leads to what I would consider to be a form of carbon myopia, or I've heard some of you talk about carbon tunnel vision. So if it's all about carbon dioxide, what about air quality? What about water quality? What about human rights and labor rights and land rights around the world? And what some people might say is, well, yeah, I mean, those are important too. Sure, we'll make some standards for those things, and we'll have monitoring and reporting and verification activities on an annual basis to make sure everybody's behaving the way they're supposed to behave, so that they can work on carbon while respecting human rights and respecting air quality and labor and this and that around the world. I'm not sure I'm against that conversation on principle, but what I would say is that a focus, in this case on carbon dioxide as the primary KPI, means that there's incentive to maximize efforts on those indicators, this specific carbon indicator. And everything else is secondary or tertiary or even at a lower level. And particularly concerning my understanding of carbon markets, and I won't pretend to be some expert, but when I think of carbon markets, what I think of is the higher the carbon price goes in a carbon market, the greater the incentive to push other areas, labor rights and air quality, water quality, the greater the incentive to push those other areas to maybe bend or break the rules, especially if no one's watching closely, because as the carbon price goes up, there's more incentive to make more money.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, the whole topic just feels so cold, you know, just like numbers and emissions and it's like some body, is making decisions that affect everyone in the world. And what would it look like if the majority of the world, the people who don't ever fly, who probably never benefit from anything related to aviation, and I could be wrong on that, like around pharmaceuticals, maybe. But even then, we know that there's disparity in who receives access to medicine. And it's that whole worldview is coming up and choking the rest of the world.
Yeah, right, Heather. And thanks for sharing, Chris. I love the fact that you took the turn and said that everything is political. I'm pretty convinced that everything is political. What I'm asking myself right now is, do you think that policy definition and or interventions, can break up power relations?
Tell me a little bit more about what you see in your mind as you're asking about this, because we could talk about the world in general, especially through the lens of, as we were calling it, Sustainability Inc. And we could talk about aviation specifically, and there are, of course, intersections and overlaps between those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, it goes a little bit in the direction what Heather said, or where Heather was headed. So in your article, you also state that the costs associated with reaching net zero in the aviation sector are basically unrealistic to reach. You know, from a Sustainability Inc. critical lens, I'm not mentioning the unproven technologies within, the framework of net zero, which often fail to address, the uneven burden of the climate crisis and the historical responsibilities of mostly industrialized nations. But from your experience, in policy making, do you kind of believe that such immense investments are justified, especially when considering the pressing needs in other areas, such as healthcare and or education? And yeah, do you think that policy making can help?
I do think that policy making can help. And of course, I'm speaking my bias, having been, shall we say, educated or maybe quote unquote trained in a very specific, and I think this conversation would say exceptionally narrow type of policy making, exceptionally narrow type of developing policy options in a very hyper niche sector, the global aviation sector, which has very unique ways of working in a very, very small subset of people involved. So nodding toward your point, Heather, that you raised earlier, there are not too many people in the world who fly. There's just a micro sliver of those people who actually develop frameworks and make decisions that affect not only everybody else who flies, but really, as you've pointed out, the whole world. So I believe that policy can help if we contextualize it as follows. I think of policy in the most broad sense as a set of mechanisms. And really, I think in this conversation, I'm talking about mechanisms implemented by states, by governments, that affect how governmental and non-governmental entities, whether it's private business or NGOs or indeed very individual people, interact with each other. So using that definition, I feel it ties very, very well into what we were just talking about regarding how everything is political, because we're talking about power relations. I think that there could be an improvement. I won't guarantee it, but I believe there could be an improvement if the conversation were broadened to include people who have not been represented. I saw in those meetings, those ICAO meetings, when I was a member of government, I saw that there were intentionally two rankings of individuals who participated. There was one set of ranks that essentially had voting power, voting members. And then there was another rank of people, the so-called observers, to use the ICAO term, that did not have voting power, but they were invited, let's say, to the conversation. And those were global NGOs and advocates and other types of organizations that some people may have even used the term, a term I don't like, these non-technical stakeholders. They were the observers. Yes.
Why don't you like the term non-technical observers?
Because when we categorize, and I'm talking really at the fundamental level, and I'm not an ontologist, but when I think of categories and our nature to put entities, whether tangible or intangible, into categories, I think of the nature to then immediately take those categories and trade them off against each other. The technical stakeholders versus the non-technical stakeholders. Some people are invited to the conversation, and other people, they manage the conversation. They set the terms of the conversation. And they also have the conversation when those invited non-technical stakeholders are not in the room. So the mere language choice, the mere categorization of stakeholders into technical and non-technical is an expression of power dynamics. And one of the strange things is I would not say that some of these quote unquote non-technical stakeholders are actually non-technical. There are NGOs in the aviation sector that do their own policy analysis. They do their own computer modeling. They have PhDs working with them, writing documents. They go on media programs and do interviews. They release reports. And in the case of the carbon dioxide standard for aircraft technology that was developed a number of years ago by ICAO, I know that some of those NGOs involved did have direct influence on the outcome of the standard. And yes, it's a series of equations buried deep in a document, and you have to run a computer model and draw some curves to figure out whether your aircraft design complies. But because of those negotiations and those power dynamics, I can see the different influences and the different stakeholders in the final result. So I start to wonder, actually, if politics begins at the very, very fundamental level, the simple choice to categorize and how we categorize and what that means.
Yeah, because we know the way that capitalism and colonialism work. And there's no way that people with that amount of power, which I would define as the ability to mobilize resources to meet needs, would give that up. And so we know that inviting observers is like, you know, I mean, that just implies passivity, that the people observing have no power, that it's performative to, say that we've engaged with the community, for example, or with stakeholders. So just the whole framing of, it's like we're starting with the given of a sector, of an industry, and who owns pieces of that, who's been given the power to regulate. All of that is just problematic from the very start, because we're talking about who has access to resources on this planet and who gets to decide what those resources are used for and why. Well, we know why. Colonialism, capitalism. Why does this very small number of people get to make those decisions? So even Lavinia, when you say, is it justified the cost? It's as if they have the right to have the money, and they need to explain themselves on how they're going to use the money. But why do they have the money? Why do they have the access to that to the resources? And I think that's when, as well, like the rights kind of narrative is problematic as well, because it's like it's very individualistic, as well as it's like we've set up this whole system on the planet, and now we're going to give some people the right to get their needs met, rather than having a system set up where people can get their needs met locally and on their own terms. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say to that. And I suppose related to that would be, what would a world look like where we know there's this technology called airplanes, aviation. And we know that moving people and things around the world has always been part of our history, moving spices to allow for food like meat to be conserved for longer, etc. And as the world became more easier to access, people move away and then they want to be able to see family. I know the three of us have people very close to us who live in other parts of the world. And the majority of the people don't know people who have their loved ones in other parts of the world. So it's like, are we prioritizing this small minority of people the right to be able to stay connected physically with loved ones versus, which is a need, that connection. People miss each other and want to be with each other versus some very like physical needs of everyone on the earth to survive. What's happening? Like, how do you see aviation being more of a tool that's in the hands of the majority of the people on the planet?
Yeah, when I think of aviation being a tool for the majority of the people on the planet, and I like that language because you are indicating, and I would agree with the framing that says here is a way that a certain select group of people have chosen to express themselves using science and mathematics. The creation of the first airplanes, the experiments before that, as far as the history books go, the experiments almost exclusively by white men in Europe, building kites, building essentially the first human carrying glider was a big box kite looking thing that was just scaled up from kites, building the first model airplanes and the first lightweight engines, and in a certain degree expressing their interests, their desires, this type of freedom of flight, as some people might say, using these very technical and fundamental techniques and methods. Yeah, this idea of a triumph of ingenuity and again, I'm rather biased because I've had an interest in airplanes since I was a child. Yeah, I think I would use the language triumph of ingenuity in the context of aviation. But I think a major underlying theme of this podcast is the triumph for whom? Ingenuity for whom? Benefits for whom? And when we expand the conversation just beyond that small minority of the world's people who have created this technology and benefited from technology and continued to benefit from this technology, this aviation sector, what is it that we see? And I think I have certainly been privileged to have been able to get on an airplane multiple times in my life for different reasons, for business, and to see my dad's mother and father before they passed, and to see my mother's grandmother before she died at the age of 102. I saw all of them just once in my life, and aviation made that possible. But sometimes I wonder if privilege is also about the things that we don't see, because we're privileged to not have to see those things, not have to experience those things. I'm not sure how old I was when I realized, actually, wait a minute, most people on the planet have never been on an airplane. Now, I think the industry would say, well, people who don't fly, they still benefit from aviation because we send products over the world with aviation, and aviation brings many, many direct and indirect jobs around the world. And we send pharmaceuticals and perishable products and really quick things like airmail and other things that just really can't get there any other way except by air. And I believe there's merit to that. I believe that the numbers, if you will, would show that to be the case. But that doesn't erase this conversation about who gets to decide, who's in the room, why do we categorize in certain ways, and who gets excluded by the mere act of categorizing.
Yeah. Thanks to both of you. That was a very interesting twist, and I learned a lot about the history of aviation. So thanks, Chris. And I also like the fact that we are kind of like stripping away the different layers, step by step, critically, but carefully. And for me personally, like the evolution in aircraft and aviation has always and kind of fundamentally been linked to military and warfare. Maybe it's because, of my German background, and like we learned it in school, everything was focused on the Third Reich, and how the evolution, especially in the, 1920s and 30s, was happening in the industry. And I love to imagine aviation to have the purpose of bringing us closer together. But so like this realm is kind of new to me. But like my final question to you is, and you have actually already been touching the point. So we come from, like, we already talked about power dynamics in regulation and policy making. And well, that wealthier populations contribute significantly to global emissions. Like, do you think the investments required to make aviation less harmful, I don't call it sustainable, I call it less harmful, could be better spent on improving sustainability in sectors that like directly impact more vulnerable I shouldn't be using the word vulnerable, communities and or populations. So I'm basically ending, with this big questions. How do we balance the need for improved aviation with global equity and climate justice, Chris?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I liked the words that you chose in your final sentence there, this word of balancing, because we've been talking already about ontology, this categorization, and how categories are made, and maybe more particularly to this conversation, why certain categories are made, why certain categories are chosen. And then what happens after categorization? Now that we have separate categories, now we can have them interact together. We can have those categories fight each other even, or we can have them, shall we say, balance each other and balance each other in different ways. And what does balance mean? So in the last few years, I've been playing around with how I can see the world in terms other than balancing, because to talk about balance, you first have to have those categories to be balanced against each other. This idea, for instance, the classic three-legged stool of sustainability, the people, the environment, and the economy. There are long-standing critiques of that classic model for exactly the reasons we're talking about, that the mere act of categorizing into these three categories, people, economy, and the environment, it enables certain types of conversations, and it also disables certain other types of conversations. So to remain holistic, or at least make the conscious choice to jump back and forth between different ways of categorizing the world, to see what insights emerge when we change those perspectives, I think that's an important exercise that we can take on. And unfortunately, at least in my case, it's a whole skill set that I was not taught formally. We were introduced to categories as if they were descended from heaven on a golden wire, if you will. We were not taught these fundamentals of categorization and why categories are made, and indeed how categorization is therefore in and of itself a political act. So I want to take your proposed categories for a moment, though, balancing aviation with equity and climate justice globally. And so from that lens, when I think about these categories, I first think about acknowledging that the world has limited money. And as you've said, does the sector deserve to have this type of investment? Is that type of investment justified? First of all, I do truly believe in the importance of including so many people who are excluded from the conversation on equity and justice, especially those who have been marginalized historically. And Heather, you've talked about colonization. You've used the word colonization a number of times already in this conversation. So indigenous peoples, and really all people who have been colonized, they're not so represented in these very, very highly technical, and I might say intentionally small conversations on aviation and the future of aviation. So even if we were to select these categories, the categories of improved aviation balanced against the category of equity and the category of climate justice, even if we were to select these categories, we can still not authentically talk about balancing until those individuals who have been intentionally excluded from the conversation are then included at an equal level of power so that we can all have an authentic conversation. There are other ways, of course, of categorizing and drawing relationships between categories. We've just talked about the political nature of categorization. So here's an example. Is there a way to talk about the contribution of aviation to equity and climate justice? So perhaps we still have those three categories, but now the relationships have been changed. So here's an example, and I will say I'm an admirer of this particular example. There's a company called Zipline that flies drones, And for once, we have an entity flying drones not for military purposes, but for humanitarian purposes. And I'm sure we could have an extensive conversation about the word humanitarian and the politics of that as well. But just for the purpose of this example, there are drone operations that have been happening for some time by the company Zipline in different countries in Africa to deliver medicines and blood supplies to people who really need it. So this to me is an example of something that, yes, I would call aviation, even though we're talking about aircraft that cannot carry people. It's certainly a use of aviation. The physics are certainly the same. The mathematics are certainly the same. But this is a type of aviation that, for me, really makes a positive contribution to the world. We could also talk about focusing on rapid travel for emergency personnel. And there are people talking about whole new types of aircraft designs that could really make that quicker and easier and safer and more cost effective. So in just exploring the relationships between categories, we can sometimes unlock new insights.
Yeah, I guess I would say money can just be printed. So it's not about money, not there not being enough money. Money's just a strategy for how resources are distributed. Um, and and all of that. So and also speaking of access to resources, unless the indigenous people, for example, but I'm not just talking about indigenous people, I'm talking about the majority of the world's people, unless they have access to the land and the resources that make it possible to be able to have that innovation that you admired of, like people creating airplanes, there's not going to be a real conversation if they're invited to the conversation, because the people with access to resources will still have more power. So for me, like part of decolonization is, land back. It's resources back. And of course, resources come from the land. So land back. And hopefully this sort of gives everyone a taste of the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having going forward in this podcast series. And I really appreciate, Chris, that you were the first of us willing to be interviewed for the podcast. And Lavinia?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think we touched so many different layers, in our first episode. And I just wanted to thank the both of you for that thought-provoking discussion. And I love how we challenge one another.
Yes, I truly thank you, Heather and Lavinia. And this is the type of podcast that I truly hope will bring this decolonial perspective through the lens of a number of different sectors and different topics, not just aviation, but there are all sorts of topics that we can talk about. And of course, the two of you are perfect examples. You have very different backgrounds than me. And all three of us have our own unique stories, not only of our own sectors, but of becoming disillusioned with the sectors that we worked in, and our own journeys, bringing us really to the nature of decolonization and questioning the systems around the world, and ultimately being in community with people such as ourselves who get it, or who at least want to learn to get it. So I thank you for interviewing me. And next time, Lavinia will be in the hot seat around the topic of greenwashing in the fashion industry. So don't miss that.
Yeah. I'm already a bit nervous, but also very excited.
You're gonna be great. You've got so much experience in this. You've written your own articles, etc. So, but we really welcome anyone who made it this far into the podcast. Please do share with us any comments or suggestions, I suppose, in the comments of the podcast. And yeah, bye everybody.
Wait a minute. Shouldn't we tell everyone what we are lach means?
Ah, yeah. Well, lach literally in German means laugh, or even how do you call it? The imperative of laughing.
So it was actually just a coincidence, really, wasn't it? Because LACH is an acronym for Lavinia, LA, Chris, C, and Heather, H. And so when I tried to come up with a word, I was like, lock. And then Lavinia's like, oh, wait, that means laugh. Or we looked it up and we saw, and not just German, like there's a couple of languages, right? Where it's like, oh, good.
Yeah, and there's for sure a couple of languages we don't know about where lach means something. But it's like whenever like I hear somebody of you, saying lach, it's like deeply in my heart, I laugh out loud. So it's nice.
Yeah, and it makes sense to take a light approach with topics as serious as sustainability, climate change, and decolonization, because at the end of the day, we are all human. We love and we laugh and we cry and we get by the best we can. So to do it in a lighthearted way is always something great.
Yeah.
Yay. All right. Take care, my fellow lachs.
Bye,
Bye.
fellow
Bye
Lachs.
bye.